Well, I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation to speak to you this evening. And I will talk about coastal wetlands, as it says behind me. But I'd also just like to mention, of course, that many of us saw this evening a couple of videos that I think is a very good start. Communication is fundamental to a lot of the issues we're dealing with. And so having those videos as a means to get the word out is a very good thing. Some of you will recall that there's not just two videos about Lake Winnipeg, but actually at least three, the other one being Fat Lake that came out about a year ago, and that's good too. Again, gets the word out. So I thought I would let you know that in the near term, in fact, we think probably sometime in the spring, there will be an episode of The Nature of Things on Lake Winnipeg. It's tentatively called Save My Lake, and I've been involved in it a little bit, and no, I didn't get to meet David Suzuki. But I think it will be a good impact because it will be national. And I think that's where this ultimately has to go. I mean, it's well and good for us to project things here in Winnipeg, but ultimately it's got to get across the country. So I'm hopeful that we'll be getting this message out to a much larger audience in time. What I want to talk to you tonight is near and dear to my heart. I'm a wetland specialist. I have been for pretty much my entire career. What I'm showing you in this slide is essentially the first time this information has been shown in public. We are just in the finishing stages of completing an inventory of the coastal wetlands of the three large lakes in Manitoba. Lake Winnipeg, of course, 10th largest, Lake Winnipegosis, depending on the statistics you use, perhaps the 29th, 30th, or 31st largest, and Lake Manitoba, the around 32nd to 35th largest. And around each of these lakes, there are enormous resources of coastal wetlands. The maps you see here are the first attempt to demonstrate just how many of them there are. And I think what is especially clear about those maps is that the north part of Lake Winnipeg, the north part of Lake Winnipegosis is replete with coastal wetlands. There's enormous resources of them. In addition to those, there are others around the southern parts of the lake. And in fact, I think we can be quite proud of the fact that in Manitoba, we have two of the largest coastal wetlands on the continent. Single wetlands, single coastal wetlands. One of them is the Delta Marsh, which is on the south end of Lake Manitoba. And the largest one on the continent is the Netley-Lebo Marsh at the south end of Lake Winnipeg. Earlier today, in fact, Premier Selinger attended a conference that many of us are attending on Lake Winnipeg and announced what I think is an exceptional contribution from the provincial government towards helping with the restoration of the Netley-Lebo Marsh. It is one of the largest on the continent. Unfortunately, as I will show you a little bit of later, also under some threat. But just to orient you to what a coastal wetland is, because there's a certain level of unawareness, I give you three examples. One that you've probably visited, perhaps, Grand Beach. It is, in fact, a coastal wetland. Perhaps I should also make the case that these are something that you should care about. You know, there's sometimes a perception that wetlands are just icky places that have lots of insects and perhaps some plants and maybe some animals, and you know, who really cares if they're gone? Well, I think there are some real tangible benefits from coastal wetlands, and I thought I would just list them for you here. Hank made reference to biofuels and the possibilities that might exist in developing a bioeconomy. Well, in fact, this is something that is not new relatively. If you look at the photograph behind these points, there's a farmer from the Gimli area who has for generations been harvesting the vegetation from these marshes as a source of hay for the livestock. And this is something that is ongoing around the lakes in many places. They use the vegetation and the high productivity of these coastal wetlands as a feedstock. We also know, based on a number of studies through the years, that it's habitat for a variety of animals, including the fish that we catch on the lake. So the health of the commercial fishery on the lakes, the health of the sport fishery on the lakes, in fact, depends on the health of the coastal marshes, where these fish may spend some time in spawning, or at least certainly feeding. So the health of the marshes translates directly into the health of the fishery. We know that it's an important habitat also for migratory birds, especially ducks and geese that, of course, go north and south each year and stop along the way to spend some time in these coastal marshes. We know that they're also really important for shoreline stabilization. And of course, we do have issues with respect to shoreline erosion here in Manitoba. And there's some evidence that, in fact, natural solutions are every bit as good and perhaps even superior to some of the artificial engineered solutions we've come up with to counteract erosion. And then perhaps most significant to the issue about Lake Winnipeg's water quality and the enormous algal blooms that are occurring on it is the effect that the marshes have on purification of water. That in effect they are the last line of defense between the landscape and the water. Water, as it's passing off the farmland or from the sewage lagoons, inevitably passes through wetlands along the way. They've often been described as nature's kidneys. They have an ability to assimilate, to break down and to store materials and prevent them from getting into the lakes. So in effect, they are a way for us to hold those nutrients, preventing them from getting out into the lake. And then in fact, if we can develop means to harvest that vegetation, it becomes then a resource. And as you perhaps heard from Hank, there's possibilities for biofuel production from doing just that. Unfortunately, coastal wetlands are under threat for a variety of reasons, including ones like the development you see here in the photograph just south of Victoria Beach, where a very nice little coastal marsh now has a number of people passing through it on a regular basis as they take their pleasure boats out into Lake Winnipeg. And this is the sort of thing that will inevitably expose this little coastal marsh to a number of factors, including contaminants from a variety of chemicals. Urbanization, however, is a broader issue. It's happening all over the world, and it's happening here in Manitoba as well. Agricultural effects, we've heard a little bit about those. Altered hydrology, the fact that marshes need fluctuating water levels to be healthy. Unfortunately, they don't always get the fluctuations they require. And in some cases where lakes are managed for narrower range of water level variation, that can have effects on wetlands associated with them. Dredging, and I'll give you an example of that in a moment, industrial and other contaminants, and then of course a range of exotic species including common carp and hybrid cattail, and then perhaps others that are on their way here. I'll just show you this picture in passing, a scene that I took not long ago on Lake Manitoba, where the cottagers felt obliged to undertake what they thought of as improvement of their beach by way of removing all of the vegetation so as to make an open vista onto the lake. And this is the sort of thing that I think counteracts the natural benefits we get from natural cover in some of these coastal marshes. Anyway, I want to come back to Netley-Lebo Marsh. As I said, Mr. Sellinger this morning made an announcement about it, and I think that's a very good thing because it is under threat. This is what it looks like. It's at the south end of Lake Winnipeg, and just to orient you, if you were to drive up Main Street all the way as far as you could drive, you would inevitably end up just south of the Netley-Lebo Marsh. It has the Red River passing right through the middle of it, out into Lake Winnipeg, and traditionally, the area to the east of the Red River was referred to as the Lebo Marsh, the area to the west of the Red River referred to as the Netley Marsh. So we, just to be inclusive, call the entire thing the Netley-Lebo Marsh. I could talk at length about what's happening there, but I'll just say one thing. There's been dramatic changes in the vegetation of the Netley part of it, the western part of it. In the east, you've got a whole series of large bays of water, in amongst which there is vegetation, cattails, bulrushes, a variety of other species. In the west, unfortunately, we have seen a dramatic loss of much of the vegetation to the effect that it's essentially not a functioning marsh anymore. It's effectively a large, shallow lake. And I think we can lay the blame for many of these changes that we've seen on a structure that's indicated by the red circle in this map, an area that we call the Netley Cut. Now, I'll just show you as a way of explanation of what this all means, a pair of photographs. The first of them here was taken by a biplane flying down the Red River in 1923. A remarkable set of photos, by the way. It shows you really how much things have changed along the Red River through the years. This is the south part of the marsh, just where, well, in fact, where the end of Main Street would leave you. And we see in the background, for instance, the Netley Creek. And in the foreground, we see a structure leading from the Red River. That Red River, of course, is that large channel we see in front of us. And to the, I guess that would be to your right, it's leading off into the marsh. And the marsh is actually a relatively healthy-looking thing in this time. And there's that channel that was dredged. It was cut in 1913, 10 years before this photograph was taken, by the dredge that operated on the Red River. The next photograph I'm going to show you leaps forward almost exactly 80 years. So from 1923, we go to 2003. And in that 80-year period, we have seen dramatic changes. One of the things, for example, that you see is the permanent, almost the complete loss of vegetation in the marsh itself. Essentially, again, it has become a large, shallow lake. In fact, this is 2003, the year that many of us will remember was a fairly low water year on Lake Winnipeg, and that revealed, in fact, the deposits of sediment on the inside of the marsh, which I think tell a lot of the story, that the water from the Red River is going through that cut and is depositing sediment on the inside of it. We think that's part of the situation. If you measure the width of that cut, well, back in 1924, when it was measured, it was about 80 feet wide, and that's actually wider than it probably was when it was first dredged in 1913. By 2003, it had increased to about 1,300 square feet. So if you do a calculation, it was increasing at a rate of about 15 feet per year. We measured it again in 2009, and it has gone up to 1,475 feet. In other words, increasing at a rate of 29 feet a year. In other words, the rate at which it's widening has doubled in the last few years. In fact, flying over it this summer, there is now an area just to the north of this cut that is starting to breach, and I suspect that in the not too distant future, that cut will double in width. One of my colleagues at the university did some measurements this past year and has determined that the flow going through this cut now is anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire flow of the river. So in effect, this is now a continuation of the Red River, and that's have an associated cost to the benefits we get from natural wetlands in that area. Well, Ray made reference to the changes in the landscape that are causing some of these changes. In effect, the flow on the river is really the problem. That's coming down that river and it's being rerouted into the Netley Marsh. Why is that? Well, as Ray mentioned, it's largely the landscape changes that have occurred. You see in this little map a view of what the prairies in Manitoba, in the Red River Valley, looked like in 1870 when Manitoba became a province. And in the upper right corner, you see the associated wetlands that were there. One of the real challenges farmers faced at that time was the abundance of marshland. And they saw this as a challenge. They wanted to get rid of the water so as to make it productive. And again, the view was that wetlands themselves were not useful. So, of course, as Ray mentioned, through a series of very well-meaning initiatives to construct dikes and dredges through channels, they managed to essentially eliminate virtually all of those marshes. The result, as Ray mentioned, vastly increased flow coming off the Red River Valley in a short period of time. Inevitably, that then causes a pulse of water to go down the river, which of course necessitates the enlargement of the Red River floodway, and of course ultimately downriver going into the Netley-Lebo Marsh through that cut. So I'll just leave you with two thoughts about coastal wetlands. One is that I think one of the problems we are facing is that shoreline developments, perhaps well-meaning, are nevertheless causing degradation. And the fact is that these coastal marshes are valuable. So we are losing the benefits of them by degrading them in these ways. And I think, therefore, there really should be some attention given to the kind of questionable activities that sometimes are allowed to occur on shorelines. The second point is that greater retention of water on the landscape, as Ray mentioned, is going to be beneficial ultimately to help us to reduce the degradation that are occurring to wetlands, to ones like the Netley-Lebo Marsh. And so ultimately the benefit of long-term water storage on the prairies is ultimately, I think, the best option we have. Not only just for the benefit of water and water quality in Lake Winnipeg, but to preserve and to enhance those nature's kidneys associated with the shorelines. Thank you.